I am so happy and grateful to take a moment this morning. Today we are September 2nd, right?
Uh-huh.
We're into the month of September. And as busy as I am grateful. And it's such a privilege to have you with me this morning because I'm so fascinated by your work and I can't wait to work with you. So today it's my little moment to share you with the world out there. So, welcome to my little studio.
Thank you so much, Zoonie, and thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it, and I really appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. So let's just start this interview. First of all, Hannah, could you please share with us? Tell us who you are. Who's Hannah?
I am Hannah. My name is Hannah Ezzell, and I am a coach and a consultant and a transformational storyteller. And I'm from the US, and I'm currently based in Montreal.
When did you get to Montreal? We want to know.
I got here in November and like just in time to have the full winter experience.
Oh my goodness. Okay, well, I look forward to go have a poutine with you
Yes.
and a good Vietnamese soup with some spring rolls
Ooh,
and coffee. Okay, I'm saying it out loud
yes, please.
so that the universe can give us that the
Yes.
opportunity to make it happen.
Everyone take note. Yes.
Okay, so let's dive right into who is Hannah. So, what is your background? Where did you study, and what
Mm,
did you study? To do the kind of work you're doing today. Share with us about that.
sure. Yeah. My background is in the arts. I studied filmmaking at New York University. I was hoping to go into that field, but I came into the film industry at a time that was before Me Too. And there was a lot of toxicity, and it was a very dysfunctional environment. And I came into that industry with a genuine love of storytelling and found that it could not really be nurtured. But what I was able to discover through that process is my skills as a coach. I kind of just started coaching people unofficially in that industry because everyone really, really needed support. And I was able to hone my skills, and eventually I started working as a consultant on film productions. So people would hire me to help develop more unique female characters to diversify their scripts and their casts. And I was really interested in having conversations about power and responsibility. But I think it was again at a time that was a bit too early for that industry. And there was a lot of pushback. But what I learned is I started to notice how hard it was for people to have conversations about responsibility, about personal power, and about issues like race and gender. And I noticed like the effect that this would have on people's physical bodies, the types of emotional reactions they would have, and also like an inability to be present, to be open to new ideas. So I became very curious about this. And I also at that time was developing my personal coaching practice more, which has a focus in creativity and in using storytelling modules like the hero's journey to help individuals develop. And I was hoping to reconcile that with my artistic background. And I reached out actually to someone who I really admire. Are you familiar with Clarissa Pinkola Estes, the author of Women Who Run with the Wolves?
Yes, I mean, it
Yes.
sounds familiar. I did not read it, but
Yes. Yeah, she's incredible. She is a psychologist and an author and also a storyteller. And I read her book a few years ago, and it was really formative for me. And I sent her a message through her website because she wrote a chapter in her book called Story is Medicine. And she presented storytelling as transformational as the first time I had encountered that. And she reached out to me and we spoke on the phone for a couple of hours, actually. And she gave me incredible, incredible advice. And I kept saying, like, I want to be a storyteller, but I don't know what stories to tell. I want to help the world, but I don't know how. And she said, look into your own family stories. And that was the advice she gave me. And it was very, very simple, but very, very powerful. And that's what began my own journey in terms of getting in touch with my family history and my lineage story.
I have I have wonderful chills listening to you. I feel like I should be dancing on my chair, but okay, I'm going to control myself. I love what you just shared. I know we didn't even get into your current work yet,
Mhm.
but how amazing is this? And I need to say this, okay? I know we're live. I need to say this. Thank you, Jimmy. Jimmy, your husband, is
Yes.
like an amazing person, and
Yeah.
I am so happy that he ended up in my life on my life journey, because and he has no choice. Both of you, you're here to stay. But Hannah, hearing you talking about storytelling and
Mhm.
sharing this and your background in film, how amazing timing, such amazing timing for me, because as you know, and I think as everyone know in my community, I'm
Mhm.
working on my first documentary, movie. And,
Yes.
and I have to bring in not just the entrepreneurship path, but women, their identity and
Mm.
their family story. And
Mm.
hearing you talking about how look into your family history and storytelling. I mean, I think that's all I've been doing for the last 15 years. I mean,
Yeah.
underneath underneath the business that I started, it has a whole story behind it. And every time I'm in a conference or I give a workshop, I always talk about where I come from and how
Mm.
that's all those stories, those anecdotal stories of my life
Mm.
make me who I am and
Mm.
brings me into the audience. Anyway, so we can have
Yeah.
another whole session about this because I just love it. And so yeah, your work is very needed, very much needed, Hannah. But today
Mhm.
let's get into your current work. So with
Yes.
that background, how did you transition,
Mhm. Mhm.
if I can use that, into lineage coaching, which is a word that ignorant that I am, because or maybe in English, I didn't even know what it meant. Like when you
Yes.
talk about lineage, I had to ask my friends, my Anglophone, what's lineage? And then I understood, but
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that word. So
Yes.
go
Totally
ahead.
fine. Yes. Yeah, so lineage really just references ancestry, and the family, but like an expanded sense of family, so to include previous generations and potentially future generations as well. Yeah, so the way that I started working with lineage is, like I said, I had that incredible conversation, and Clarissa Pinkola Estes really motivated me to go look into my own family history, which I did. And this was about 5 years ago. So I've done about 5 years of research. And on my mom's side of the family, my two family sides of my family, my two lineages look very different. So my mom's family came to the US as refugees in the late 60s from Cyprus. They're ethnically Turkish, but from Cyprus, and there was conflict there around that time between the Greeks and the Turks. And so my mom arrived in the US when she was 3 years old, and my grandparents, had a third grade education. They didn't speak any English. They had lost everything. They moved to New York City, and in a lot of ways, they lived some version of the American dream. They worked so hard their entire lives, and they managed to create a comfortable life for themselves and for their daughter. But there was also a lot of difficulty and a lot of pain. And in many ways, they still, carried the weight of what happened to them and still do, and the betrayal of their neighbors, of their community, which means it's very hard for them to trust people, and they're kind of living in this hyper vigilant state. So when I started learning more about that side of my family, what that looked like is we went back to Cyprus, to the village that my grandparents had to flee. It was the first time they had been back. since the war. And we went with my mom and my two sisters, and went to the place where their house used to be, which is now a parking lot, and went to the mosque, which is now abandoned. And I witnessed kind of the emotion that was surfacing in my grandparents. And I went back to Cyprus a few other times and found family members that we had been disconnected from. I heard the stories of what people had experienced in the war. I crossed the border many times because Cyprus is a divided island. And I learned about my Turkish heritage, which, because of assimilation, is something that was not really passed down to me through the generations. So I learned how to make Turkish coffee and how to read the coffee grounds, to read fortunes the way the women in my family do. I learned the recipes. I spent more time intentionally with my grandparents. Um, and it was largely a very beautiful and also very intense process. And then on my dad's side of the family, my dad's family has been in the US since the 1600s. They came, I think, from England, and there are just huge amounts of records about their history in that country, because as white Americans, their history was recorded. Which is very different from my mom's side. My mom's side, because they're refugees, because there was war, the records are a mess. But my dad's side, there's very careful records of everything. It's all been digitized. It's all available on ancestry.com. And so I have hundreds and hundreds of documents about
Wow.
dating back to the 1600s, a lot of handwritten wills. And one of the first things that struck me about that history is something that I had long suspected, which is that my paternal ancestors were enslavers of Africans in the US. And they lived in North Carolina for many generations. My dad also grew up in North Carolina on the same land that was worked by the enslaved people. And my family monetarily benefited from that forced labor. And one thing that I have been careful to do is to look for connections between that history and my own life. And one thing that has struck me is I think that my generation, my sisters and I, are the most privileged generation since the time of the enslavers. And we have benefited from that the most because that land stayed in my family until 2008. And for the generations before that, like my dad did not grow up with money. His grandparents, or his parents and grandparents, didn't. But that land was sold within my lifetime, and the profits of that land are what paid for my college education. So there are very clear connections between that history and my own life. And so that process has been about encountering that history and that pain, and not turning away from it, and taking responsibility for it, and learning how to talk about it, because it's a history that is shared by many in North America, who have been historically privileged, and is something that is just not shared and talked about. So I think learning about these histories and then reconciling them within myself, because we don't see instances of these two stories being reconciled in the world, has been a huge journey and a huge undertaking. And when I was doing this research all of these years, I thought that it was for an art project or something similar. And at the beginning of 2020, I sat down to write a family memoir, telling this story, and then the pandemic hit. And a lot of the themes from my research that I had seen about, oppression, about victimization, about trauma, um, I saw them kind of being stirred up in my family and in my country and in the world. And I realized maybe this isn't just a storytelling project. Maybe this isn't just a memoir. Maybe this is a methodology. And maybe I can take all of the tools that I have developed for myself and learning to carry these stories, and I can share them with other people and help support others in their own family journeys, in order to reconcile with the histories that we all carry and with the trauma that we carry, and in order to transform that pain into new ways of being, into sources of strength, and into healing.
That's amazing. So you are the first person that you worked with
Yes.
Lineage Coaching. You
Yes,
basically
I'm a
coach
very difficult
yourself.
client, very difficult
Okay.
client, yes.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that journey. I mean, to be honest, I got a glimpse of that because I was lucky enough to be attending your very first workshop. So we'll talk about that. But that's amazing, Hannah. So this is actually tested and proven by you and the sharing. Oh my God. And you are such a amazing storyteller. I mean, I could just sit here and listen and I could just like visualize, what you're describing. It's fascinating. Okay,
Mhm.
so you realize that this is something that could really be, you know, to say useful. It's not the right word, but it would be really a rich experience
Mm,
to help others with their stories, their past.
mm.
Can we just look at my story just for a little bit so that I
Yes.
can do a parallel with you? So I think you know a bit of about my story, right? I witnessed horrible things that a child of 8 years old shouldn't have witnessed. So I went through that whole war thing in 1975 on the last boat that was leaving Vietnam when the communists from the north took over. And
Mm,
it's horrible, seeing all that blood, that killing and that violence, and almost dying and drowning on that boat, and then becoming refugees in a camp, and then getting accepted by Canada and having to adapt and grow up here and being bullied. So all of that, I have, many things that I had to go through. I think I did a certain amount of work in order to find inner peace,
mm,
but I can see how beneficial I think. So if you can,
mm,
if you have somebody like me, right? Because there's so many of us refugees who came here to how would you help someone like me with all the traumas that I had to go through?
mm. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing a bit about your story, Zuni. And I'm a big fan of your journey. And I think that, first of all, I think that you have done a lot of work within your life to help reconcile with your history, including your documentary project, including the time that you spent in Hong Kong, and including like your relationship with your children, kind of creating a healthy family dynamics between you and your children. So I think first I would really want to highlight that so that you can take like healthy pride in the experiences that you have already had, that really show your strength and your resilience and your capacity to heal and to embrace life. And I think that's the foundation to addressing any pain that might still be there, is just by embracing that positive narrative, that positive story. And then in addition to that, we would work on just some really simple embodiment techniques to help move anything that you might be carrying in your nervous system. And this comes from my training in somatic experiencing, which is a training that I'm still going through. It's a 3-year program, which is a way of addressing trauma through the body and through the nervous system. And it's based on animals in the wild, and that animals in the wild are routinely under threat, but they rarely carry trauma. So they have natural processes of releasing stress after they're in intense situations so that they can continue without carrying the remnants of that stress. And I think the idea of somatic experiencing is that we as humans have just become disconnected from those natural processes. So, if we were to work through some of your intergenerational trauma, we could do some very simple exercises to help remind your body that you're safe, and to release any historical stress that you might be carrying. And then, in addition to that, I think that we would want to embrace like those positive aspects of your culture, um, and really practice those intentionally. So embracing like the Vietnamese cuisine and of course the coffee and any practices, rituals, holidays that are dear to you, really being intentional in your practice of those and embracing them and sharing them with your children and sharing them with your parents and your siblings, so that you have these strong connections to your culture that cannot be taken away, even though you're no longer in Vietnam. And the story of your lineage has changed continents, you still have that connection to that culture, that beautiful connection to your heritage. And then in addition to that, I would say the final thing we would want to do is, and I think you're already very good at this, but to create, yeah, to tell your story. So to practice telling your story in a way that uplifts your family, that uplifts and empowers you, and that is inspiring for others to hear, that is inspiring for the world, so that people can learn from what your family experienced. And all of that pain and intensity can be channeled into sources of empowerment and good, which gives your family lineage and you this deeper sense of purpose. Mhm.
That's amazing. It's like music to my ears.
Uh-huh.
And this is really really wonderful. It's interesting because so the trauma that I went through,
Mhm.
but then I met my husband Brian,
Yes.
who didn't go through that. But it's interesting
Mm.
because his family, so he's Canadian here from Montreal, but he
Mhm.
comes from a very he has diverse cultures, right? So his mom is Irish and Scottish,
Mhm.
and his dad is Chinese, and so my
Mhm.
kids are a bit of everything. So that too, and
Yeah.
more, Hannah. I know this is not one of the questions that I was supposed to ask you, but I have to ask you. So many
Yeah.
kids now around me, so many families come from different
Yeah.
cultures. Like, look at yourself. Like you
Yes.
have, and so. Can we use
Yes.
lineage coaching? Can we work with you in
Yeah.
order to also bring all of that, those wonderful, rich, different, colorful? I guess
Yeah.
I'd see it as colorful. How do we
Yeah.
use lineage coaching to make sure that our kids and their kids will
Yes.
benefit from that?
Yes. Such a good question. Yeah. I mean, I find it very inspiring to see, yeah, how there are so many mixed, like multi-ethnic, multiracial kids being born. And I think it is a really big opportunity in like conflict resolution. In addition to many other things, but in the sense that I'll speak about my own journey. Two of the identities that I carry that I feel like are in conflict in the world are that of the refugee and that of the white American. And in my own country, there's a lot of tension between those two identities, and those identities I've had to reconcile them within myself in order to just exist. So I had to do that work. That's very hard work to do. And unless you have that type of personal motivation, you probably won't do it. So I think that there's a huge opportunity in children and adults carrying multiple identities, but it can also be very challenging. And we need to be able to support kids who are going through this process. And I think one of the potential challenges is feeling like you don't belong anywhere, right?
Yeah.
Because, you don't really fit in, if you carry two identities, you don't really fit in one and you don't really fit in the other. You have a bit of both, so you're something entirely new. And that can be confusing and isolating, but I think through practices like lineage coaching, we can create empowering narratives so that kids actually realize that there's something incredibly special about carrying both both lineages. And part of that means, understanding what even it is that they carry. So being able to connect positively to all aspects of the cultures or heritages that they carry, being able to also understand maybe some of the difficulty that might be associated with that, but in a way that is grounding and that brings healthy perspective to the lives that we're leading. And then being able to understand that um, there's something incredibly beautiful about uniting two different parts of the world or two different stories. And out of that, there's the opportunity for something entirely new. And that's huge. The opportunity to create a new sense of identity that also honors past heritage and past generations, but makes space for future generations to live in entirely different ways. That's incredible, actually. Hmm.
They don't teach what you're talking about in school. But I'm just like, why, why not? Can you
Yeah.
see that? And I don't know how
Yeah.
young yeah, I think, kids or young people, I know I teach one course at a CJEP level, and,
Mm.
often they have to go back and look into their family history in order to make a mini documentary movie.
So
And
cool.
it would be so fit for you to be teaching,
Mm.
in such a course. But like how, when should we think about maybe learning more about lineage, or working with somebody like you?
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think that like one of my answers is like you'll know when it's time. Like you'll know when it's not time and you'll know when it's time. Um and then I think the other answer is I think often during like transitional moments in life is when there's a lot of like creative potential in our lives, and we also have a lot of curiosity about things, and we also need a lot of support in terms of like creating whatever it is that we're stepping into and honoring whatever it is that we're stepping away from. So I think like moments where people are coming of age, so perhaps like becoming adults, um, also like becoming parents. Probably not when you have newborn children, but when they're a little bit older and you start to become curious about creating intentional family culture, about honoring, your heritage, as well. So I think that's a really good time. And I think also when people become elders or become grandparents, that's another time where they're really in touch with the story of the family. And I think that that ties into, our historical culture as humans, where the elders really carried the stories of the community and shared stories and wisdom. And that was their role, was to pass on those stories to the younger generations and to guide them. And I think that that archetypal role is something that people still feel. So I think that's another potential time for lineage work. And then I think the other thing that can happen is, I think every family has someone who's really, really curious about the family history. And I'm kind of fascinated by this. But, most families have a family genealogist or someone who has expressed interest in that or who asks a lot of questions. And I think that for those individuals who, for some reason, have felt a personal calling to really get in touch with their lineage story, like this work can be profoundly helpful as well.
I think this is a good time, I think, to
Mhm.
ask you to give us more details, juicy details about how do we work with Hannah? How does it
Mhm.
work? The workshops, the coaching. Can you share
Yes,
more about that?
absolutely. Yes. Hmm. Yes. So I do one-on-one coaching, first of all. And I have different programs for that. They're hugely customizable because everyone's family stories are different. So the type of work that we'd be doing is really dependent on your family history. So the way that that works is if someone is interested in doing a multi-week program with me, please get in touch and we can have a session where we, get in touch with each other, you share your family history, and we can create a multi-week program together that will best support the unfolding of your journey. Usually the way that it works is I like to do things in 3 parts. The first couple of sessions will be about just becoming more aware of your family history if you haven't already. Um, the second part of the coaching process, so the additional sessions after that, will be about kind of healing your relationship to your family lineage. And then the third part will be more about reconciling your family with the world. So, being able to tell your lineage story, to be able to find a deeper purpose within it that informs the type of work that you do, the life that you lead, the way you give back to the world, etc. So that's one-on-one coaching. And I'll also say that lineage healing is a lifelong process. So we can do, these intensive programs or multi-week programs, but really it's something that will continue to unfold. So I'll just focus on, creating tools that will help you in that unfolding. And then I also offer small group work. Over the summer, yes, over the summer that took the form of online workshops that were open to the public. So basically anyone could register for those, and I had different themes. The first one was called Gateway to the Collective, which is about how the family is a really great mediator between the family or the individual and the collective. So it's very easy when we look at world issues, large scale issues, to feel overwhelmed or to feel unsure about how we can interact with these things. But because the family is the first group that we're a part of, the first community that we're a part of, the first collective that we're a part of, if we find a way to healthfully interact with the family, that relationship can mediate between us and the world. So it's actually a class about scaling in a way where we feel like, yeah, we're relating to the world in a way that is healthy and not overwhelming. The second workshop that I taught was called Embodied Genealogy. And that is about just using somatic embodiment tools as we research, as we discover stories about our family members, as we listen to stories from our family members, remembering that we have that body connection, and that's what actually will make the work sustainable so that we don't burn out or become emotionally overwhelmed. The third workshop was called Inherited Trauma, and that's about intergenerational trauma, how it works biologically, and how to support people who carry intense trauma who we're close to. So, how to support traumatized loved ones. The fourth workshop was called Ancestral Ritual, and it focused on kind of finding and embracing rituals that exist within our family heritage and our culture and practicing them with meaning as a way to honor ancestors. And then the fifth workshop was called Family Legacy, and that workshop dealt with, how to tell the story of the family, how to find a deeper purpose within it, and how to connect the family story with the story of humanity, so with the greater story that is unfolding. Yeah. So those are some of the workshops that I've taught and that I still offer. And I'll just also say that one thing that I'm hoping to do more, and this idea I think also kind of came from you, Zoonie, is the idea of doing small group workshops with groups of friends, community members, and loved ones. So if there is something within your own lineage story that you really want to work on, like something specific, like Zuni, if you were like, I want to work on the refugee story that I carry, then you could form a group with other people who you're close to or who are in your broader community who also carry refugee stories. And we could do a workshop or multiple workshops just unpacking that specific aspect of your heritage. And then because these are people that you know or who are within your community, it will create a deeper sense of support as well. So that's another thing that I offer if there's a group of people who want to do more specific work. Yeah.
That's amazing. Oh my God. Thank you for all the rich and flexible
Uh,
Well, I guess everything starts with a discovery session with you, right? Because
yes.
I'm telling you, Hannah, I'm very interested. Well, not just for me,
Mhm.
my story, my documentary project, but also friends of mine, forming like a group, and
Yeah.
that's why I'm doing this. I'm hoping to that you will allow me to share this interview because I really think the work you're doing is so important, to say the least. And I think, to go through life and not knowing where you come from or the richness or the everything that happened in your past. For me, it just doesn't make sense. It's
Mhm.
hard. It's hard to choose your path and to go forward,
Yeah.
fully in harmony with in the world that you live if you don't know where you come from and
Mhm.
your parents, your grandparents. So it's amazing. I really think this should be, you know, be taught in a lot of places, schools included, and communities, and but there's only one Hannah, so I imagine that you're gonna have to do either multiply yourself or do something virtually.
Right. Yes, I would love to eventually do trainings also, for anyone else who wants to do this type of coaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I feel like there is a lot of need for support and having these types of conversations. And I think it's a very emergent type of conversation that we're not used to having. So yes, there is definitely a need for a lot of support.
I'm
Hmm.
sure you're going to share. Well, we're going to share informations when we release the when we go,
Yes. Yeah.
the website and how do we sign up and so on. So to
Yeah.
wrap up this amazing conversation, Hannah,
Mhm.
thank you again. But how? What do you think the impact or the of your work,
Mm,
considering the craziness that we're
mm,
going right now? There's mental health, emotional, spiritual. There's chaos around us
yeah.
since the pandemic. What do you think the impact of your work can bring to heal or maybe
Mm,
help people around us?
mhm. Yeah, it's such a big question. Mhm. Just gonna sit with it for a minute. Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely an intense time, and I think we all need as much support as possible. And I think that also the opportunity of the pandemic is reevaluation and kind of reevaluating what's important. I know that I've done that in my life. I got married during the pandemic and moved to a new city. So I definitely practice what I preach. Um, and I think another thing that has been happening, in 2020 and 2021, and I think will continue to happen, is like these large scale collective issues that are surfacing. And that includes the pandemic. Like, in a sense, the pandemic is a collective trauma that is unfolding. It is something that we're all experiencing together that is affecting us individually. It's affecting our families, our communities, and the world. It's affecting our culture. And we're going to see the effects of that for many, many years. And hi, Toby. And and I think that first of all, just having an understanding of how trauma functions is very useful, and how to prevent trauma is very useful in navigating this time. And then I think the other thing that is happening a lot is we're having kind of the resurgence of a lot of historical trauma that has been surfacing. So in my country, that looked like a lot of, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, which is where I grew up, and kind of the protests that happened afterwards. And in Canada, I think that relates to, the discovery of the graves of the Indigenous children at the residential schools. And more, there are a lot of historical events that are kind of emerging and coming up out of the woodwork. And people are having intense emotional reactions to them. And our narratives of identity, not just of individuals, but as cultures and as nations, are being challenged. And I think that it is time more than ever to address a lot of these historical traumas. It's time for some of us who had historical privilege to take responsibility. It is time for those of us who carry historical trauma and pain to seek out support and allow ourselves to begin healing processes. And it is time for all of us to come together healthfully and create a different future so that we're not just repeating these cycles of pain um, on the collective national level, on the familial level, and on the individual level. And I believe that we all have the capacity to do this. I believe that there are simple supportive tools that can help. And I believe that it's hugely important and it's timely.
I'm speechless. Wow. Thank you so much, Hannah. And I hope you're ready. And I hope you're gonna I hope you're ready for all of this work.
I'm
You're
ready.
gonna be busy.
I hope so. Yeah.
I know so. I think so. Thank you so much, Hannah. I know that this cannot be, I mean, it ends here, but I know there's going to be more sessions because there's so much, and I would love to open this up so that people can ask you questions. So that's why I would
Mm.
love, if you allow me, to do another live session where with an audience so that
Yes.
they can ask you questions as well. But oh, I love this. I
Yeah.
really, really love this. Thank you so much. And I can't wait. I can't wait to begin my work with you.
Thank you so much, Zoonie. That is a wonderful attitude to have. And thank you for hosting this and for sharing this work with your community, and also for the life that you've lived and the journey that you've taken, which is so unique and so inspiring, and I know inspires me. And I think also really speaks to the human potential for healing. So thank you for that.
Oh, I just want to give you a big hug.
Uh-huh.
Virtual hug. Thank you so much, Hannah.